Okay. Okay. Thank you for being here. My name is Kai Blois. I'm a PhD student at INSPER University in Brazil, and I'm going to present my joint work with Marcelo Santos on employment insurance, informality, and precautionary safety. So mainly when we talk about labor markets in developed countries, we have to talk about informality. So the main difference between formal and informal workers is that formal and entitled to receive unemployment insurance benefits, minimum wages, social security benefits, severance payments, and so on, while informal workers don't have any type of social insurance from the state. Okay. So in Brazilian labor market, informality is quite widespread. So we can see here that we have higher shares of informal workers in every income quintile. So we can see that it's quite prevalent among the bottom quintile, but it's still prevalent at the top quintile. Okay. So our paper wanted to see what are the effects of unemployment insurance in our economy with informality and precautionary safety. So, but how is strong this interaction between unemployment insurance and informality? So many when we talk about the literature about unemployment insurance, we are concerned about the moral hazard issue, that people are receiving unemployment insurance benefits and increasing the duration of unemployment. Okay, since the government agents cannot monitor the search effort, the unemployed worker stays in unemployment a little bit longer, that would be optimal. Okay. But when we talk about unemployment insurance in developed countries, we have to take the issue of informality. So informality in developed countries may push the guy to the informal sector at the same time that they receive unemployment insurance. Okay. So here we have evidence that is the share of EY takers reporting receiving the unemployment insurance benefit and working in the informal sector at the same time, okay, among all individuals collecting unemployment insurance benefit. We can see that from 2012 to 2018, this share came from 33% to 24%. So I'm not claiming anything about the business cycle on this environment. I'm just saying that the share of people collecting employment insurance benefit and going work in the informal sector is higher despite the business cycle condition. And this can lead to less formal job creation than we would expect. So the informal sector is crowding out formal job creation in that sense. Okay. But how is this strong? This is interaction between unemployment insurance, savings, informality. Okay, so we may think that individuals that work in the informal sector, since they are not entitled to receive any protection from the welfare state in Brazil, they would rely more on precautionary savings to smooth consumption during a bad state of nature. But it's not what we see on evidence. Here on the right graph, we can see that formal workers saves more compared to the informal worker in relation to the net income earnings. Okay, so mainly informal workers, they are more constrained individuals, they are more hand-to-mouth individuals, and so this is one of the reasons that there is a high share of savings from formal compared to the informal. And when we consider the top 40% that are those that really saves on Brazil, there is a bigger difference between the savings from formal and informal workers. So although formal workers are more protected by welfare states, they rely more on precautionary savings than informal work. Okay. So what we do on this paper, we build on a Diamond Morton Sarid's search-match model and we incorporate the following features. We introduce informality in this type of model, so the individual can search for a job in the formal or the informal sector. The labor market is not segmented, so the individual can find job in the formal one. If you not find job in the sector, it can look for a job in the informal sector. We also introduce Incomplete markets framework mean think about the setup of Bewley, Huggett, and Ayagari type of model. So the individual can self-insure using a riskless asset against unemployment risk or an insurable idiosyncratic shock. Okay. Like I said, we have an insurable idiosyncratic shock, so the agents are going to be heterogeneous, exposed because they face some productivity shock. Depending of the shock, they may carry this bad shock for a long time on this economy. We have also endogenous job destruction. So depending of the net, the firm or the individual, they can break this contract and stays unemployed or do not hire anyone to this vacancy. The wage setting is going to be determined by a national bargain environment. So the firm and the worker, they are going to split the surplus among them, and every period the wage is going to be set in the formal and in the informal sector by a national bargain environment. And we calibrate and estimate the model for the Brazilian economy. Okay. So we introduce a more complex design of unemployment insurance than most of the papers of Sertimetti do. Okay, so in January, the papers, they assume that once a worker is unemployed, he can collect an unemployment insurance benefit and stays with the benefit forever unless he finds a job. So here we introduce two criteria to see how this interaction with the possibility of the worker receiving or not receiving an unemployment insurance benefit. So there is eligibility criteria. So to become able to collect the benefit, the worker must spend a specific time in the formal sector, must have a specific tenure, calibrated and designed to fit with Brazilian legislation. After that, if the work is laid off, he can collect an employment insurance benefit for a specific number of months. And after that, the benefit run out. So if the worker like to collect an employment insurance benefit again, he must go back to the formal sector to become eligible again to collect the benefit. We also introduced the classical replacement rate, how much from the previous wage, the replacement rate is going to substitute from the previous wage. Okay. And we intend to evaluate changing those counterfactuals, change the eligibility criteria, that is the entitlement effect, the level that's controlled by the replacement rate, and the duration that's controlled by the exhaustion, how the unemployment insurance policy is going to affect the labor market's outcome on this economy. So what we find is that the key component to understand this interaction between unemployment insurance and formality is the exhaustion period, how many UI installments the individual could collect about unemployment insurance benefit. So when we increase the number of UI installments from 2 to 9, that's 2 to 9 months, the share of people collecting unemployment insurance benefit and work in the informal sector increases from 5 to 30%. So if the individual is collecting unemployment insurance benefits, since there is very difficult to go government to monitor if the worker is searching for a job or is working in the informal sector, we collect the benefit and goes work in the informal sector, okay? And the number of UI installments is key to understand this interaction. About the savings, we can see that when we increase the eligibility criteria, that is the number of months that you have to spend in the formal sector to become able to collect the benefits. From 3 to 12 months, there's an increase on formal worker savings. So when it becomes more difficult to collect an employment insurance benefit, formal workers increase his savings, since he's forward looking and they're seeing that's going to be a little more difficult to collect an employment insurance benefit. And the classical results of those papers of unemployment insurance in Sertimetti model, when replacement rate rise, the unemployment goes up while savings goes down. So a more generous unemployment insurance may crowd out some savings from mainly for the formal workers. Okay. I'm going to skip the little by the sake of time. Okay. If someone has any question. Okay. So the source of heterogeneity among workers come from three sources. Okay, we have the individuals are going to be heterogeneous in asset accumulation. So exposed, they're going to be asset accumulation. So they're going to have a wealth distribution on this economy. They are going to be exposed to heterogeneous on uninsurable idiosyncratic shock that this is going to govern the productivity on this economy. And the individuals are going to be heterogeneity if they are eligible or not eligible to collect an employment insurance benefit. So those state variables here, I of E is equal to 0 when he's not eligible to collect the benefit, and equal to 1 when he's eligible to collect the benefit for I of E and I of E. Okay. So in this model, the search is random. So the worker is not looking for a specific firm, and the firm is not looking for a specific worker. There is a pool of workers, of unemployed workers that the firm can find a new worker to replace, to fill the vacancy that they created. The time period on this model is monthly. So every monthly, we're going to have interaction when all the things occur in this economy. And we have different probability of find job in the formal and the informal sector. Okay. So just a brief description about the value function for someone that's unemployed. Like I said, the state variables are the level of assets, the productivity shock, and if the unemployed worker is eligible or not eligible to collect the benefits. So the individual in this economy is risk averse. So we may think about a CRA function with risk averse coefficient equal to 2. There's a discount factor that's going to bring to present value the continuation value. And we have a Psi that's a probability of staying alive in this economy. Mainly, we introduce this life cycle components. The individuals do not accumulate too much assets. So we have a probability of this individual to die, and they are going to born again in this economy without any resource. Okay. With this probability U, that is the exhaustion stochastic matrix, we're going to govern the possibility of the worker become eligible or not become to collect the unemployment insurance benefit or not collect the unemployment insurance benefit. Okay. So with probability PU, the benefit run out and the worker must go back to the formal sector to become able to collect the benefit again. And with 1 minus PU, he can keep the collecting the unemployment insurance benefit. Okay. So he finds a job in the formal sector with such probability facing uninsurable idiosyncratic shock. So depending on the shock, he may choose to go to the formal sector or stays unemployed. If he not find a job in the formal sector, he goes find a job in the informal one. Again, if the job is not very well suited to this worker, he may continue unemployed. And if he not find job in neither of the sectors, he stays unemployed. Okay. So here we have the budget constraint of the worker. So he's eligible to collect the benefits if he's eligible to collect the benefit, he may collect the unemployment insurance benefit. It's not, he has a household production to not stay without anything if he's not eligible to collect the benefit. Okay. The formal worker, the structure is almost the same thing. The only difference is that you have a probability of staying eligible, of become eligible to collect the benefit. That is governed by this stochastic matrix of P of E, okay? And we have isogenoous job destruction probability. So with this probability, he stays employed, and with this probability, he may go to unemployed, okay? The only difference of the budget constraint from the government, from the unemployed to the formal worker, that now that he was working, he cannot collect the benefit. The formal job only works through he become eligible to collect the benefits, but the individual faces taxes that helps to balance the budget, the government budget constraint to finance this unemployment insurance policy. Okay. The informal worker is pretty similar to the formal one. The only difference is that they do not face any tax burden, but he may collect an unemployment insurance benefit if he's eligible to that. Okay. So the value function of the firms work in a similar way. So the value function of the formal firm faces some taxes on production function and payroll taxes, while informal firms, they do not face any type of tax burden, okay? However, the informal first, they face some penalty parameter that's going to be increasing on the level of productivity, okay? This idea is to capture in a reduced form way the idea that productive informal firms, they hire very productivity workers. This is going to capture the idea that those workers are going to work in bigger firms, and bigger firms are more subject to be to face a government penalty since it's easier to find bigger firms that are hire informal work. Okay, so since the firm is not bigger, or in that case the individual is not so productive, this penalty parameter is going to be minimal, indicating that mainly small and medium firms that are going to hire informal workers. Okay. Let me skip that because sake of time. So, like I said, the Nash-Barger environment, we're going to have formal workers and formal firms. They're going to split the surplus every period to have a wage setting that is going to be determined by the surplus of them for the formal worker and the informal firm. So in January, when the worker is eligible to collect an unemployment insurance benefit, this can work as a threat point to the firms, since this is going to increase the wages for someone that's formal. Okay. Let me skip that just to show the target and non-target moments of this model. The model reproduces well the labor market's characteristics of the Brazilian economy, mainly recalibrated to the Brazilian economy from 2012 to 2014. That was a period previous the recession that we faced. And the model just understate a little bit the informality rates and understate a little bit the share of informal UI takers. Okay. Also, there is the data reproduce a higher share of savings in the top 40% of the savings rate for the formal workers, while the model do not reproduce a little bit of that. We're still working in the model. This is a failure of this type of Bailey-Hagett model that do not fit so well the wealth distribution of this economy, but we are working to do better on that. Okay. So just to show some results about the paper. So here we see the share of savings for formal workers, and we can see that when we increase the eligibility criteria in number of months, so when we increase the number of months that you have to spend in the formal sector to become able to collect the benefit, from 3 to 12 months, the savings of the formal workers increase. And this pattern is quite strong when we consider the top 40% savings rate from the formal workers. So when it becomes more difficult to collect the benefit, the savings increase from 4.5 to 6 to 5.9, okay, percent of net income earnings. Okay, it's the idea that the individual are forward-looking and they are seeing that it's not so easy to become eligible to collect the benefit, so they rely more on precautionary savings. as we increase the exhaustion criteria on this model, so the number of UI installments that you can receive, the share of people working in the informal sector and collecting employment insurance benefits among everybody that is collecting employment insurance benefit increases from 5 to 30%. So when you increase the number of months that receive the benefit from 2 to 9 months, a lot of people are going to collect an employment insurance benefit and work in the informal sector at the same time. Okay.
Hey, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
About the previous slide. What is the actual eligibility criteria in Brazil?
Is 6 months.
6 months.
You have to spend 6 months in the formal sector to become able to collect an employment insurance benefit.
Thanks.
Okay.
You have 5 more minutes and then 5 for questions.
Another interesting result that we have is that when you increase the replacement rate of the unemployment insurance benefit, we also have a decreasing share of formal workers. So one thing that I'm talking about mainly formal workers, although we have informal on this model, is that when we take in consideration that only formal workers become eligible to collect the benefit, the unemployment insurance only for someone that spent time in the formal sector become eligible to collect the benefits. This type of design of unemployment insurance is going to affect mainly the decisions of formal workers, including the decision of go out for the formal sector and collect an employment insurance benefit in the informal one. But the savings decisions are more affected by the formal workers. So when we increase the replacement rate from 30 to 90%, and just a little concern that in Brazil, the replacement rate is about 8%, while we take in consideration that in the United States, the replacement rate is 40 to 30%. The share of savings of formal workers decreases from 5.9 to 5.2. Of course, this effect is stronger when we consider the top 40% that are those that really saves on this economy. So the share of saves decreased from 6.4 to 5.6. Okay, and we also have effect on unemployment rate. So when we increase the replacement rate, there is a little hike on the unemployment rate from 7.1 to 7.2. Okay, and stays in the same pattern, almost in the same pattern during other exercise of replacement rate. Okay. So the partial conclusions that we have, most of the papers of unemployment insurance, they overstate the role of unemployment insurance benefit. We must take in consideration the role of unemployment insurance eligibility and the exhaustion criteria. Okay, the eligibility is quite important to understand the role of the precautionary saves multiple. Okay, so when we increase or decrease the number of months that you have to become eligible, this is going to affect the savings rate mostly to the formal workers. Okay, and the exhaustion criteria, the number of UI installments that the worker may receive when eligible to collect the benefit, is crucial to understand this interaction between unemployment insurance and informality. So when you increase the exhaustion criteria, the individual may combine this unemployment insurance benefits to the wage paid in the informal sector and go work in the informal sector, which is a little bit different from the classical moral hazard issue that we are used to see on classical papers about unemployment insurance. Okay, thank you. Any question? No question.
I think I have one question. Do
Yeah.
you, in your framework, do you allow for changes in the wages as you change this policy?
Yes. Every period, the wage is going to be setting by a national bargaining environment. So every period, the wage is going to be set different depending of the replacement rate of the unemployment insurance benefit, or if the worker has more assets or not, have a greater or lower quantity of assets in this economy. Okay. So let me just go back quickly. So every period, this wage set is going to be determined. It's not something fixed in this economy. Okay, good. Thank you so much for their attention. Let me stop sharing.
I have another question, I guess, but
Okay.
it's I don't work in this area, but just for somebody that's unfamiliar with the literature, what would you say is the takeaway? What's the contribution and the novelty of your presentation and paper?
Okay. So most of the papers, they overstate the role of unemployment insurance benefit. Okay. So we have to take in consideration the role that that this unemployment insurance benefit have informal and informality and informality. Okay. That mainly they assume that everybody in this economy can collect unemployment insurance benefit, and this is not true. We have to become eligible to collect the benefit again. And most of the people, they assume that there is a lack of the literature that we do not see the effects of unemployment insurance on savings combined with the informal sector. So I believe that we can.
But it's not because most of these models are sort of based on like more developed economies where informal sector is less important.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
There is a lack of this type of literature in development economies.
Yeah, I kind of understood it, but I think sometimes like pitching it again at the end and hammering it's useful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let me stop sharing.
Jose, do you want to share? Okay, feel free to wait one more minute or you can start now. It's up to you. Sorry, by the way, Jose will take clarifying questions as we go and then bigger discussions and Q&A at the end.
Yeah, that's perfect. Can you hear me well? Perfect. Hi, thanks for attending this presentation. Today I'm going to present this paper called International Remittances and Inter-Household Risk Sharing. Okay, so there is an important body of literature, like broad literature about the effects of remittances on education and several things. And also there is a growing literature that tries to understand like the insurance role of remittances. And you have papers that use macro data and papers that use micro data. Those using macro data find that basically when countries receive like a bad productivity shocks or during recessions, remittances from abroad help to smooth consumption. Basically, for example, Katri finds that a decrease in GDP per capita of $100 are compensated with an increase of $18 from remittances from abroad. Similarly, in the microliterature, they also have findings in this direction, but using microdata and other types of identification strategies. But the idea is the same. When you receive bad income shocks in the home economy, basically these are developing countries, some of these shocks are smooth using remittances from abroad. One of the most influential papers is from Jan and Choi, and he finds that 60% of the declines in household income are replaced by remittances. Another finding is that there is a small consumption response to shocks in households that have migrants compared to households that do not have migrants. So these remittances incomes not only smooth the income that households have, or not only relax the budget constraint, but also help to smooth consumption over time. And that is great. Basically, if you have a family working abroad, imagine that I'm working abroad and I left my family back home. If my wife is not doing very well, she lost her job or she has a wage reduction, I can send more remittances, and in that way we can smooth our household consumption. So that is well established in the literature. What we don't understand very well is how these households with migrants and with access to remittances respond to shocks in terms of other insurance mechanisms. Basically, how remittances affect or are related to other self-insurance mechanisms that households can use, for example, precautionary savings or the labor supply of each household member. And that's what I'm trying to do in this paper. I study the relationship between remittances and other forms of self-insurance, the labor supply choices of each household member, and precautionary savings. So basically, I'm going to compare households with migrant and households without migrant. Now, let me give you a quick overview of what I do. I'm going to develop a heterogeneous two-earner household model with endogenous remittances that is going to include the key intra-household risk-sharing mechanisms that I mentioned above. I'm going to calibrate this model with data from the Dominican Republic, a panel data set that has remittances received by each individual, each household member, and the hours worked and wages by household member. And then I'm going to use the calibrated model to quantify or kind of decompose the sources of this household insurance that households with remittances, access to remittances have, and households with no access to remittances. And we will have like some welfare calculations in terms of the importance of this insurance. So now let me show you the main ingredients of the model. It's going to be a standard heterogeneous agent model, like an Ayagari type, that is going to have two earners. I'm going to assume, based on what you observe in the Dominican Republic, that one is going to be a female and the other is going to be a male. And there are going to be two types of households. One that has an overseas worker with access to higher earning profiles, and the other type of households where both stays in the Dominican Republic. And I'm going to take the migration decision as given. Basically, that is not going to be a decision, and that cannot change over time. And households are going to choose consumption of each member, labor supply, remittances, and their asset position. In terms of risk and insurance in this economy, each household member is subject to productivity shocks every period, and the productivity process will have some persistence. This is an incomplete market economy. So you cannot fully insure using ROW securities. So you don't have a state contingent securities for each state. And the sources of insurance that these households will have are the labor supply choices of each household member, savings, and also the presence of the other member. Basically, if you receive a shock, just by having the other member in your household's budget constraint, that is going to help you to smooth consumption. So now let me show you the optimization problem that the household solved. And in terms of preference, it's going to be the same for both type of households or almost identical. The key difference are going to come in the budget constraint. So the state variables are assets position in period T, the productivity level of each household member. One is going to be the female, two is going to be the male. And then the choices are going to be consumption of each member, C, leisure of each member, and the asset position for next period. The utility function is a standard. The only new thing that I'm had to use are this parameter phi j that basically are going to be like a fixed cost, fixed time cost that households have to do. And this parameter is going to help me to match the average hours worked by each type of household. So for example, not all the time that you are not working is leisure. So you can interpret this like some kind of housework that doesn't report you any leisure. In terms of the budget constraint, let me start with the households without migrant. This is also kind of a standard. We have the consumption of each household member. We have the labor earnings from the male, where epsilon is the productivity, 1 minus L2 is the labor supply. Similarly for the female, an important feature is this parameter theta1 that is going to help us capture the female wage gap in the home economy. And that is also going to help us to pin down the labor supply differences or female labor force participations, which are smaller. And then we have changes in our asset position. So basically the sources of risk in terms of the budget constraints are going to come through these epsilons. And the idea is to see how these shocks are going to affect our consumption. In an economy where people are fully insured, basically shocks to the epsilons are not going to affect consumption, and consumption is going to be completely smooth over time. So that's what we're going to test, like how these shocks affect consumption, but also like how these shocks affect other households' decisions, like the labor supply or changes in the asset position, to also help to smooth consumption, since this is not a complete market economy. What is going to be different in the households with an overseas workers? The first subtle thing is that I'm assuming that the overseas worker is going to be the male, and that's like in 75% of the cases that we see in the data. So I'm focusing in this case. It can be also the other way around, like the migrant can be the female, but I'm focusing on this case. Then prices in the foreign economy are typically higher, and I'm capturing this with the parameter gamma, which is greater than 1, that says that prices of consumptions are greater in the foreign economy. And the other important parameter is going to be this theta f that captures the foreign to home male wage gap. and that is going to be in the order of 5. So basically, because of important differences in these parameters, like households without migrants and with migrants will have different distribution in the allocation of work of their members. So that is going to drive much of the actions that we're going to see. Also, there are going to be differences in the productivity process, but most of the actions are going to come from this huge difference in terms of the earnings. And finally, remittances. We haven't talked much about remittances. It's going to be endogenous, and it's going to be basically the difference with and defining it between the earnings from abroad and the consumption of the overseas workers. In terms of the definition of remittances, this might not be like completely realistic, because like the underlying assumption here is that I'm not allowing the overseas workers to save in the foreign economy, but in terms of the insurance in this economy, it's not going to matter where the savings happen. And as you can see, basically, the problem that these two types of households are solving are very similar. Now, let me use this diagram to illustrate how we think about insurance against a shock to one of the members in this economy. So let's focus on the case, and the intuition is going to be the same for non-migrant and for migrant households. And let's focus on the case to a shock to the productivity level of the female. So as I mentioned, if the economy is fully insured, what is going to happen is that that is not going to affect consumption at all. So we want to see what is the effect on consumption, and then we want to think about insurance in terms of the difference between the pass-through of the shock to consumption and one. Basically, the part of the shock that is not pass-through consumption is the part of the shock that is insured. So for example, if the shock doesn't affect consumption at all, we are fully insured. So we start with a shock to the female, and let's try to work with each part of the budget constraint at once. So when you receive the shock to the female, if the female doesn't adjust the labor supply, then the shock is going to affect consumption directly from the perspective of, in terms of what the female can do to insure. But the female can work longer hours, or females who were not in the labor force can start working. And in that way, they can smooth the effect, the initial effect of the productivity shock. So that is going to be the insurance from the female. At the same time, if the female knows that they have other sources of insurance, like we will see, if the productivity shock is like really bad, she can decide to work fewer hours and be patient and work in the future when she is more productive. So in that case, that would magnify the effect of the shock and give you like a negative insurance. Now, another line of defense here is going to be the male labor income. And for the male labor income, we have the typical reaction that can be the male can work longer hours, and in that way helps to smooth consumption. But there is also another important channel that is called the composition effect. That is basically because of the presence of the male in the budget constraint, shocks to the females are not able to decrease the household consumption completely. So for example, let me give you an extreme example. If the share of income of the male in the budget constraint is 99%, and the share of the female is just 1%, even if the female has a really bad productivity realization, that is not going to affect the budget constraint by much, and therefore it's not going to affect consumption by much. And then the final line of defense used by these households are going to be savings. They can adjust their assets positions to smooth consumption. So we haven't said anything about remittances yet. So basically, what is going to be the role of remittances? The role of remittances is going to be linked closely to the male labor income, because for these are going to be the overseas workers. Basically, households with overseas workers are going to have this foreign wage gap that is going to affect other households' decision. For example, the composition, the share of males in the budget constraint. So in that case, we can think that this composition effect is going to play an important role. But at the same time, because of changes in the level of income of the household and the level of savings, it can be also the case that the way in which these females and males react to shocks are going to be different than for households with no migrants. So what I'm going to do now is to talk very briefly about the calibration and then move to the results. Basically, I'm calibrating 17 parameters. 7 are going to be income parameters related to income, 8 preference parameters, and 2 technology parameters. I'm going to calibrate the female to male wage gap, the foreign wage gap, and these fixed time cost parameters jointly with the solution of the model. And what I'm targeting is the average hours worked by gender and type of household, the gender wage gap, and the migrant to stayer wage gap. And notice that this gender wage gap and the migrant to stayer wage gap are not the same as these parameters. These are going to be the observed wage gap, taking into consideration that we don't observe these theta 1 and theta f in the data. And then we have like the productivity process parameters that are going to be this rho are the persistent and the sigmas are the variances, and these are estimated externally using the data. And I also take some parameters from the literature. So now let's move to the results. So before
you have 6 more minutes, just so you know.
Oh, perfect, thank you. In terms, so before, as we have been talking about, like before talking about insurance, let's first think about the transmission of the shocks to consumption, and then from there we can have a clear interpretation in terms of insurance. So the question is, what is the final effect of wage shocks on consumption? So these etas are going to be shocks to the female and male wages. So what we want to see is what proportion of these shocks is passed through household consumption. And that is going to be captured by these parameters kappa, kappa 1 and kappa 2. And I'm going to estimate this using simulated data from the calibrated model. So typically in the empirical literature, people use like actual data, but consumption data for developing countries is hard to get for panel data, and usually when you find it is of low quality. So this is why I'm taking advantage of the model for this part. And how are we going to interpret this kappa? Basically, if kappa is equal to 1, that means that a shock to the female passed through completely to household consumption, and you have 0 insurance. If kappa 1 is equal to 0, that means that this shock to the female doesn't affect household consumption, and then you are fully insured. In other words, insurance is going to be measured in this setting. This should be 100, sorry about that, because this is in percent. 100 minus kappa 1 and 100 minus kappa 2. So what I find is in line with empirical findings that households with migrants are better insured against shocks to females in the home economy. So 90% of the shocks are insured for households with migrants, which is slightly bigger than the 84% of non-migrant households. So that gives us an idea that if non-migrant households are not doing like that bad compared to households with migrants. And this is probably because they are doing other things to achieve the insurance. Also, in terms of insurance against male shocks, households with migrants have less insurance. And this is because in this economy, the migrant or the overseas workers is the male, and that's the main earner of the household. So this is why they have less insurance. All in all, when we take into consideration insurance against the two shocks, the insurance of households with migrants are equivalent to a 1.8% of lifetime consumption increase. So overall, they are better insured. So now let me move to consumption insurance against female wage shocks. And I'm going to focus on this case in the interest of time. Basically, and I know I have 2 minutes, but let me start with a simplified version of the model to build the intuition, where household members are not allowed to adjust their labor supply. So the only thing they can do here to smooth consumption is use savings. In this case, we also find that households with migrants are better insured, and in addition to savings, we can realize that they can also use, because this is against female shocks, the presence of the male earners, basically, and that is going to be driven by the share of labor income. For households with migrants, the share of males in the labor income is going to be almost 90%, and that is going to absorb exactly that same part of the shock. It's kind of like that part is protected against female wage shocks. And I wanted to start with this case because this is going to be the most important channel. So now we can move to the full model where we allow to adjustment in the labor supply. And what we find is that the income composition is going to absorb a lot. And something that is a little bit striking at first is that you can realize that this is insuring more than 100% of the shock. And why is that? This is basically because as a response of the shock, changes in the female labor supply, they reduce the hours worked, and that magnified the initial effect of the shock. So this insurance is not only insuring the wage shock, but also the magnified effect of the shock. And I'm running out of time. And in addition to that, what I can highlight from here is that male work is the main source of insurance for both types of household, basically explained by the high composition of males' labor income, and females in households with migrants are able to adjust more downwards their labor supply in response to shocks. And I also have results for male shocks that are basically that households with migrants mainly insure using savings, and households without migrants mainly insure with female work. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions or suggestions?
No, I have a suggestion, Jose.
Yes, please.
No, it would be nice to see an exercise of consumption and equivalent variation, just to see when you have these trucks and when you control for fixed labor supply and you allow flexible labor supply, to see how this affects the welfare on this economy. I believe that you can decompose for male and female, and just to see how they better or not better, depending on what's happening. Okay, and see the effects of remittance on that.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Like basically fixing the labor supply of each of them, because I computed the consumption equivalent variation, but for the full model. That's this 1.8.
Oh, okay.
But that's comparing the full model with the full model. But I think we can also like learn something like the value of this flexibility.
So yes, yeah.
And this is only for these are gains in terms of insurance. Like if you account for level gains, it would be like 60%, because this household increased their level of consumption like dramatically.
Right.
And permanently.
Can I take a look at the setup of the model? Sorry, you can go ahead.
No, just you say that you are in Ayagari type of model, so you see the effects on general equilibrium, like interest rates and those prices.
So I solved it for the general equilibrium, but for what I'm doing, I'm just comparing like the two type of households in the same distribution.
Okay.
So it's not necessary to change to other prices.
Okay. Okay.
But if
No,
I do the
Maria.
exercises that you are suggesting, there I would need to change the prices.
Okay. Okay, no more questions for me.
No, thank you very much. You wanted to see the setup?
Yeah. It's just, yeah, I was, sorry. So I guess I have the question of how important the assumption is of, taking migration as given the choice, right? And I know that makes them a lot more complex. And also the household utility function, right? And if you allow that intra-household bargaining power to, I mean, just thinking about the paper that's coming, that's what I was sort of where my mind was taking me as you were talking about female and male wages and all of that. But of course, that makes it less tractable. It's just, yeah, something that came up.
Yeah, here there's no bargaining, and migration can be important, but I believe that this is more like a long-term decision. It's not a margin that, because this is I should have said that this is a developing country that needs like visa. If you want to migrate, it's hard to get a visa. And
but there's illegal migration, right? So we all know right now what's happening in the US
but it's not so easy, because we have to first go to Mexico and then cross the border.
I know, I'm Ecuadorian, but there still happens, right?
Yeah. I'm just saying it's harder. So you can imagine, like, we can assign a probability of migration here. It's still going to be like small. So I don't think it's going to change the result by much, especially in terms of insurance.
Yeah, no, that's probably valid. It's just, for the non-familiar person.
I should emphasize more on that. No, thank you very much. Do you want me to track your time?
I'm good, thank you. But if you can stop sharing, that'd be great.
Oh, perfect.
All right. So can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So this is going to be a very different paper in terms of flavor. And it's joint work with Kate Embler, who's at IFPRI, and Kelly Jones, who's not American, but was also my former colleague at IFPRI. And so this is about measurement of intra-household resource control. And so exploring the validity of some experimental measures. And so I should say my background is on experimental economics and behavioral stuff. So it's a methods paper. And the motivation behind it is the fact that measuring individual decision power within households is difficult. And economists typically use one of two approaches to empirically identify how much say somebody has in the household, right? So the approach that perhaps you guys are familiar with is the first one, which is people write and empirically identify household models of behavior. And so Ghibbori and Mazzocco have this paper in the Journal of Economic Literature summarizing the structural approach, right, to estimating intra-household bargaining models. And so the requirement of these models is rich consumption data sets that are often available in developed countries only. And so if you want to use this approach to, say, evaluate the effect of an intervention in a developing country in a particular setting, it's just unfeasible. And the second approach that's typically used by a lot of development economists is the survey modules of household behavior that are designed to measure different aspects of interest. So modules that measure access to resources, decision-making power over expenditure categories, individual agency, and by that I mean freedom of movement and how free you are to make your choices, marital quality, and domestic violence. And so this long modules of survey questions typically map onto different domains of empowerment as defined by Kabir 99. So those are typically classified in terms of access to resources, agency, or achievement outcomes, right? And so it's like decision power and empowerment, female empowerment is this fuzzy thing. There's an underlying variable and it's unclear how do we measure it if we don't have access to this rich data set to estimate the household models. So the paper is going to be methodological in nature and it has the same flavor to what Seema Jayakandran presented yesterday with a different approach. So what our paper is going to do is investigate a third approach, which is the following. Can we use two simple incentivized lab measures of resource control in the household elicited from spouses to get a good proxy of decision power within households? And so we are by no means the first one to sort of propose or ask this question and to use lab experiments to study intra-household behavior. There are important contributions by Nava Ashraf, Simon Shainer, Ingrid Almas, Horacio Atanasio, and co-authors, among others. And a summary of or a review of the literature using games or lab experiments in the field to study intra-household behavior is provided by Alistair Munro in his 2018 piece. What we are going to do is contribute to this literature by conducting the same exact experiment in two countries with large sample size and very different context before any intervention has occurred. So typically what happens is people collect a lab measure from one spouse after an RCT happened, and then you use it as an outcome. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so it gets reported sometimes. And so we're going to conduct a systematic analysis at baseline to sort of try to understand how the measures correlate with each other, and then with household behavior outside of the experiment. So it's kind of a simple exercise, but we think it's useful for people who've thought about how to measure this. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that. So we hope that this paper contributes to that literature. So a few features about the experimental design, and please do interrupt me if you have questions, because in experimental papers, it's all about the design details. So there are two tasks. The first one is going to be a willingness to pay task, which is similar to the one used by Almas and co-authors in the EJ piece. So suppose I have here $100 in terms of stakes. And so what we're going to ask you first is, we would like to give your household $100. Who would you choose to receive this money, yourself or your spouse? So then suppose you say you. Then in the second decision, we ask, what if instead we were offering to give your household 100 if received by you, or 150 if received by your spouse? Would that change your decision? And so the second decision introduces this tension between your preference for who should receive the money and maximizing household resources. And so in that sense, it provides us with a coarse measure of willingness to sacrifice household resources to control income. And so we are going to call this willingness to pay for resource control. And it's very similar in spirit to the previous Alma's measure, though they find the exact indifference point, but it's in Macedonia, so the sample is different, and that was just unfeasible where we run this experiment, and I'm going to tell you that in a little bit. So the second task is a standard dictator game choice. So we give people, suppose it's $140 now, and they have to decide how to split it between themselves and their spouse. Importantly, we're not going to allow 50-50 to be a choice option, even though that may be what households choose normally. We think it's just very focal and it may generate an experimenter demand effect. So we don't allow it in the study. And then they make the decision in private, and then as a surprise, they actually get to make it again with their spouse, talking in private, not scrutinized by the experimenter. They just tell us what their final choice is. And so this private and joint decision has been used by previous papers. So Simon Shainer does it with dictator games, and then Carlson and co-authors in the context of risk experiments. The idea is that you can use the distance between the private and the joint decision as a proxy for how much the joint decision reflects individual preferences. So in terms of implementation, important details, we conducted a lottery first before either task. And the idea of this lottery is that any outcome of a decision in the experiment could have resulted by chance. So this allows essentially spouses to hide income from each other in the experiment. It's plausible deniability, and it's super important. So we conduct it first so that we can explain to participants along the experiment that they can choose to hide income. And every instructions are in the paper where we take extreme caution not to, induce any type of behavior. Either the lottery or a decision made by a spouse is selected to be paid. We don't provide feedback about decisions to participants, and they never find out what their spouse chose. That's important. So people know that X parts are coming, or decisions. They don't know what each part entails until the decision actually has to be made. So that's important. And then payment is done separately and in private. No receipts are provided, and no feedback about what decision is paid is provided either. So we had, of course, ethical clearance, and we took extreme care to make sure that there weren't going to be negative repercussions outside of the experiment. Stakes: expected household earnings are approximately twice a daily wage participants could have earned for work in the study area. This is normal in these types of settings. So it's typically 1 to 3 days wage for these intra-household experiments. Study samples, we ran this in 2 settings, in Ghana and Uganda. So in Ghana, the experiment is going to take place in the Northeast, very rural and remote area with 1,025 couples. They're 5 hours away from the biggest city in the north of Ghana. They rely on subsistence farming, live in a remote area, and importantly, they were scheduled to participate in an RCT that was randomizing contracts for irrigated land, and whether the contract was assigned to the husband or the wife. So it's a selected sample of households, and that's important to keep in mind because it, for external validity reasons. And then, it's a setting that has a large share of polygamous households. The households could choose which wife to sign up to the study. So we only see one wife in polygamous households and one husband. In Uganda, we have twice the sample size. And this is near Jinja in Uganda, which is a more commercial city with an active economy. So again, these households are scheduled to participate in an RCT that is designed to increase women's empowerment. But these households are going to be sugarcane contract farmers, and they're actually selected because they held contracts with a large sugarcane buyer. And so any household that held a contract and could be located is actually included in the sample. Again, here we only see one wife in polygamous households, and it's the wife most involved in sugar production. So a few implementation differences. In Ghana, so Ghana experiment took place first. And so here we conducted the experiment separate from surveys and in a central place in the village. So like an experimental session. I actually was on the ground and trained the enumerators before everything started, just to make sure that we were measuring what we thought we were measuring. And so we had 12 enumerators simultaneously conducting interviews in private booths between spouses. And so the two spouses were interviewed separately by two enumerators, made decisions privately, and then they came together to make the joint decision. And it all happened quite quickly and in very controlled environment where there was no information flow or anything like that. Here stakes were 10 cities and 14, so for task 1 and 2. And we had a short fee. In Uganda, it was a much larger sample size, so taking this approach wasn't feasible. So what we did is tag along the lab experiment to the survey data collection, like the baseline data collection wave. And so what happened is we conducted the experimental measures, elicited the experimental measures at the beginning of the household survey, so before any of the survey was asked. And that's important because then the experimental measures aren't being primed by whatever you answer in the household survey. And that's a more normal, perhaps feasible approach for development, like standard data collection waves in development projects. So it was also interesting to see how feasible that was to conduct. And so here you have one enumerator, interviews occur sequentially, private decisions from both spouses first, and then the joint decision together. After that, you have the household survey. We did randomized stakes here. So 1/4 of the sample received the higher stakes in the dictator game, and show fees much lower because we were visiting people at their home to conduct the experiment. So a few things to keep in mind in terms of sample characteristics. So these are our two samples. The big, as I said before, 1/3 is polygamous. That's same in both countries. People are slightly older and have been married for longer in Ghana than Uganda, but the most important difference is going to be education. So here you can see that 78% of wives in the Ghanaian sample don't have any education, whereas that share is only 18% in Uganda. For husbands is something similar, 60% in Ghana relative to 6% in Uganda. So there's going to be various differences that we're going to have to keep in mind as we look at the results. So here we have the price paid for resource control. And so positive means respondents sacrificed 50% of household resources to receive the money. Negative means that they were willing to sacrifice 50% of household resources in the experiment not to receive the money, so to have their spouse get the money. 0 means they didn't sacrifice any household resources. And so a few things to note. We do see that there's higher mass among higher bins for wives than husbands. There's a big share of people who don't sacrifice any income. This is actually higher than what is typically documented in experiments. And that's because previous experiments typically test efficiency using corner solutions. Of course, they were truncated, so you're underestimating the share of efficient households. I think something that stands out to a lot of people too is the negative willingness to sacrifice household resources. It turns out that the Almas et al. Paper documented the share of households that had negative willingness to pay. And since then, various papers that have used their approach document this. What we can do in this particular paper is ask, okay, so who's sacrificing money not to control the income? How odd is this? And is it associated with what type of behavior outside of the experiment, right? So another thing to note, I'm going to focus on the price paid, so positive or negative. You could order the four choices that result and by the underlying latent variable, placing bounds on the variable they're capturing and using an order logic model instead. I'm not going to present that today, but the results are similar. It's actually more straightforward if you use that approach. Okay, so first I'm going to show you gender differences within households, then the correlation between the experimental measures, and then what you may actually be interested in, which is household behavior. So here what we have is just a model on, willingness to pay for control or not to control income on a wife indicator and household fixed effects, standard errors clustered at the household level. And what you see here is that wives are willing 5.9 percentage points more likely to pay to control resources in Ghana than husbands, and less willing to pay not to control income. So consistent with a higher willingness to pay for resource control. Similar pattern in Uganda, though these differences are smaller. But if I show you the order logit model, you do see this robust difference, right? With wives having that higher willingness to pay for resource control. If we look at the dictator game, not a lot of differences between the private decisions of husbands, wives, or the joint decision in Ghana, but we do see some tension in Uganda where wives want to assign themselves more than husbands want them to have in that dictator game. And so again, I can show you what the differences look like in the model that similar to what I showed you before. And what you see here is that there are, again, few differences for Ghana between husbands and wives within households. Here, I'm showing you as a dependent variable, the distance between the joint and private decision made by individuals. And what you see is a higher distance for wives than husbands. So this means that they're less influential over the joint decision, a pattern that is replicated in Uganda. In Uganda, we also see that there's this higher share that wives want to keep relative to husbands in the dictator game. So next we ask, what is the correlation between the experimental measures? And so this may look trivial, but it's important because theoretically, the dictator game is one where it's not incentive compatible for respondents to give you their true preferences, because any allocation that is made in the experiment can be done at home, right, at no cost to the household. It's very cheap to look kind and then undo that at home. And so we wanted to ask, are the two measures picking up the same thing, essentially? And so here what we have is a correlation, so a regression of being willing to pay for resource control. It's a 0-1 variable on the dictator game choices. So this is how much the wife assigns to herself in the dictator game. And what you see is that there's a positive correlation between the amount that wife keeps in the dictator game and being willing to pay for resource control in both Ghana and Uganda. Adding controls for the husband's choice, the joint decision doesn't really change that much. You see a similar pattern if we use that distance variable, right? Higher distance means lower influence over joint decisions. And even if we just look at heterogeneity and preferences, so a lot of this distance variable effect is actually coming from the distance heterogeneity. And I'm showing you only willingness to pay for like control. I could show you the order logit model, same pattern of correlation. So we have this robust result that essentially is validating dictator game choices as measures of resource control in the house. And so next we ask, check how I'm doing in terms of time. I'm good. How do the variables correlate with behavior outside of the experiment? And so for that, what we do is use this rich data set that we have from the household surveys and construct standardized indices on the different domains that we may be interested in. And we did just create one index of decision power because we want to see how the measures are picking up the different sort of modules. And let me show you or describe what exactly we're doing. So this is the results for Ghana. Forget about the results for a moment. In the columns, we have the dependent variables. So this is an agreement index, psychological violence incidence, physical violence incidence, wise access to resource, and decision-making power. So what we're going to do in the tables is regress the dependent variables, so the column variable on the variables here on the left. And so model 1 is going to be the willingness to pay measures with being willing to pay for control and being willing to pay not to control, so that negative willingness to pay for resource control variable. And then model 2 is going to use the dictator game choices. We don't see much in Ghana. So yes, some stars, but that's given the number of hypotheses we're testing, that's not systematic and we don't take them as meaningful. However, in Uganda, we do see systematic results. And so let me go over what this actually is saying. So here, what we see in model 1 is that being willing to pay to control resources in the experiment is associated with lower marital quality at home, lower access to resources, and then the one anomalous finding, higher decision-making power. But this is the only coefficient that's weird. Everything else is in the hypothesized direction. Here, willing to pay to have spouse control resources. So this is the negative willingness to pay for resource control is associated with higher agreement, with lower domestic violence incidents, higher wife's access to resources, and higher decision-making power. This is actually interesting because it's women who have power who are willing to pay for their spouse to receive the money. And this is not something you might have hypothesized ex ante. And so that's something interesting that comes out of the data. And I think it's useful for a lot of the people that are using the Almas et al. Measure and who don't know what to do with this negative. So do they truncate it to 0? What is it measuring? What is it correlated with? So in model 2 with the dictator game choices, I think the story is a little clearer to tell, or perhaps easier to explain. So here, what this says is that the amount wives keep for themselves in the dictator game, the more they keep, the less agreement there is in the household, the lower the marital quality, the higher the domestic violence incidents, lower access to resources, and lower decision-making index. So the more they keep in the experiment, the lower decision power they seem to have in the household, right? We can also look at the distance variables that that the literature has used. So this is the absolute distance between the decision made by the wife and the joint decision made by both spouses. And so what you see is the higher distance, which means less influence over the joint decision in the experiment, lower marital quality, higher domestic violence incidents, lower wife's access to resources, and lower decision-making power. So again, a very clear story on the experimental games picking up meaningful behavior outside of the household. Turns out that a lot of the results from model 3 are coming from heterogeneity in preferences. So what we see here is just the absolute distance between the husband and wife allocation in the dictator game. Decisions made in private are associated with, so higher distance is associated with higher domestic violence, lower wife's access to resources, and lower decision-making index. This is consistent with previous work in the literature that's showing heterogeneity in preferences is actually associated with worse household outcomes. So higher rates of divorce in Germany, or inefficient savings in Kenya in the work by Simone. And so I have shown you, I guess I forgot to say this in this last 2 slides or few slides when I was looking at behavior outside of the experiment, I was showing you results for wives only. In the paper, we do have it for husbands as well. But the story is similar. What else should I say? Just to summarize, we study the correlation between this willingness to pay for resource control and dictator game choices, and we find this robust correlation in both samples. We validate dictator game choices as measures of resource control in the household. And this is important just theoretically because of the properties of the measure that makes a lot of people skeptical, including myself, I guess, at the beginning of this study. We study how predictive the measures are of behavior outside of the experiment and find no systematic correlation between behavior at home and in the lab in Ghana. In the full sample of observations, now we're revising the paper. So we're adding a model to the appendix, an inter-household model. And then also we have looked at the correlations in the subsample of Ghana that looks like that of Uganda. So that has some savings, that has higher education, that has above median expenditures, and you do see action there. So it helps us kind of understand when the experimental measures might be useful for researchers trying to collect a simple proxy for resource control. And we do find strong correlations in Uganda. Behavior in the lab mirrors behavior at home in this sample. So I'd be very happy to get your comments and suggestions. because we are working on revising this paper. But in terms of the discussion, I think, of course, there are implementation and sample size differences that may help explain the different results. However, I think what's a useful lesson for somebody who's thought about how to measure these things is that contextual differences may be important. So experimental measures may better capture household behavior in settings where literacy levels are not very low. So like Uganda versus Ghana, that's true. Individuals use money in important aspects of their everyday lives. So our Ghanaian samples not that monetized because they rely on subsistence farming. And then looking at the subset of households in Ghana that look like those in Uganda supports these conjectures. And so we're trying to provide a little bit more analysis on that type of comparison. Other insights, when trade-offs are necessary, incentivized choices elicited from wives only are enough. They seem to be enough. There's little additional explanatory power gained from the measures from the husband or the joint decision. And to my surprise, just a simple private dictator game elicited from the wife can go a long way in providing a measure of a proxy for resource control in the household. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to take questions or comments and suggestions.
I have a question, like, and I know it's almost impossible to measure like cultural behaviors, but do you think that can explain something? I know that that's probably almost impossible to measure. And
do you mean like household norms?
Yeah,
or just
like
the differences between the two samples on like the cultural aspect?
No, like households norms that have been in a country or a tribe like for generations. So that could be explaining a lot of the differences.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I've thought a lot. I've written the appendix with the household inter-household model is written, and I've thought aloud about what can explain that negative willingness to pay result, right? And yes, if you have strong household norms about who should receive the money or who should control it, that could explain it. But then it's not clear that that should map into higher power for women. So it's also what it seems to be consistent. I don't know how familiar you are with inter-household bargaining models, but there's this separate spheres model where the assumption is it's a bargaining model, but instead of divorce, the outside option is the uncooperative equilibrium in the household because transaction costs for divorce are too high. And you can also rationalize some of the outcomes with in developing nations and in our sample with that sort of uncooperative result forever as the result of like the marriage just not working and divorce being unfeasible or too high because of cultural norms. It could be. So this is a lot of hand waving because we have pretty specific sites and not a lot of variation on, culture within site. But a lot of the papers in this region of the world seem to be suggesting something like that, the separate spheres sort of domains where one person does this, one person does that. I was also thinking that if there's a strong norm about once income split, this is your income and this is mine and you control it, and so in a household, then one would be willing to pay to have the spouse earn that income and control it and not undo that choice outside of the household, right? So what's puzzling is that you sacrificing money and having that negative willingness to pay means you could have earned more money and then given a transfer outside of the experiment, and that's not happening. And why is that not happening? But I think it's consistent with what you're saying, right? So this cultural norms, sharing rules, and who earns what money, who controls what domain. It's related to other stuff I've been working on the productivity gap. And so I'm not a super expert on that domain, more of a measurement and lab experiments, but it's been fascinating to think about these things.
Yeah, I think it's hard to measure or model that kind of stuff, but
I thought that we were going to figure it out. And Yeah.
And I have another question, like why do you need to compare the two countries? Would it be enough to just focus on one? Like what do you get from having both countries?
Just, I mean, in FPRI, we work in tons of sites and development projects. You kind of want to know how exploring the validity. I think for a lot of what I do is internal validity in the experiment, but I think trying to understand how useful they are in different contexts, and the fact that we see the same properties in both countries, except the mapping to household behavior, means that we are picking up something in Ghana. It's just not mapping onto household outcomes. And so why isn't that happening? And so it's just, truly, to me, this is not a groundbreaking research, but it's useful methodological points that may help people who are thinking about this. And a lot of us are thinking about it. And so I hope it helps researchers, more than it being like this revolutionary paper, because it's not.
Thank you.
So I think then we're out of time, right? Okay. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you all. And yeah, I guess we had a tough competition with that La Sea Al Capone session. So I bet a lot of people are there.
Yeah. Nice to meeting you all too.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.